Hello everyone, my name is Akshay Sehgal and this is my presentation for the final project I did for my coursework, that is pattern recognition for my master's program. So this is about the analysis of clustering of k-means and by using DBSCAN, that is density based clustering algorithm. So moving ahead, so pattern recognitions, as you know, it helps to recognize patterns from unknown data samples, from random data, and how we are going to recognize pattern. There are various techniques, various algorithms, and I've used two of those. So clustering is one of the most prominent thing which is used to recognize pattern. And how clustering works is to cluster similar data on the basis of input or labels or similarities in the data set. So clustering is a technique to group similar data together in such a way that the points in the same cluster are similar to each other and are a bit different in some way or the other than the points in the other cluster. So there are multiple techniques for clustering: partitioning, hierarchical, fuzzy clustering, density based, and model based. In this presentation, I'm going to consider only partitioning and density based clustering. Okay, so moving ahead, the first is k-means clustering. K is the number of clusters that we want to, separate the data set into, and is a technique to cluster data set around the center points that are called centroid. And this is done by calculating the Euclidean distance between the centroids and each of the data point. And the point is assigned to the centroid which is closest to that particular point. And this is how you can see in the image on the left that each point is assigned to a centroid position which is closest to that point. So ultimately what we are trying to do is we are trying to create clusters which have their own centroid and each point is assigned to that particular centroid, so resulting in bifurcation of the data into clusters. So what are the steps involved in k-means? First is initialization of centroids. So initialization in k-means can be done according to two techniques. One is randomly allocating the centroids, which is not much efficient, and another is using the k-means plus plus algorithm, which initialize the centroid based on the how sparsely data is distributed. So we can have centroids uh, uh, aligned away from each other so that to let the system converge in a more efficient manner. So how this happens, I'll discuss that later. So the second step is, after initialization, is assign values to the closest centroid. So then revise cluster centers and repeat above steps until convergence. So the important thing is, what is convergence? When we are assigning class data points to the clusters, to the centroids, so how it is working is, basically we have like initial set of centroids and each data point is assigned to those centroid, but that centroid can be at an optimal position or can be at a non-optimal position. So the what the algorithm does is, algorithm based on the density of the data, it generates new centroid position. As you can see in the figure on the left, that there was initial centroid called C1 and then we have another centroid in next iteration, that is C1 dash. So the system does these iterations again and again to reduce the total sum of Euclidean distances between the all the data points and the centroids. What is the math behind the k-means clustering? So I have talked about Euclidean distance. So basically it's a distance between 2 points, and that can be given by the equation, the first equation that is here. And next is, if each cluster is denoted by Ci, then each data point is assigned to a cluster. So all the data points has to be aligned to some cluster or the other. So this equation shows that the data points are assigned to the respective clusters. So suppose Ci, C1, C2, C3, C4, and we have like 10 clusters, so C10. So each data point is assigned to one of the cluster, and their distance between the data point and the cluster, that is what we have to reduce. So the system converges when this distance between the centroids and the respective data points reduces to the lowest value. So how it is in random allocation of centroid, it may be efficient, it may not be efficient because we don't know the centroid point. But when we use k-means plus plus and we assign centroids on the basis of density or how sparsely data is distributed, so the chances of convergence are high. So last is finding the new centroid for the cluster group of points. So basically, this is the equation for finding the new centroids, and it is based on the density and how the mass of the clusters is basically distributed in the plane. I'll discuss now the datasets I've used for it. So first is the blob dataset. This is basically synthetic data that is generated by utility in the sklearn library. So next is my wine dataset, which I selected from the UCI repository. And last one is the Birch dataset. So this dataset is selected because it has a lot of records, around 100K records, and I wanted to see how the clustering works for a large set of dataset. Important processes and techniques. So before going into the experiments that I performed, I want to discuss about the important processes. So first thing is, when we are moving into clustering algorithms, we have to transform our data from the standard form into a scaled down form. So to get it into a scaled down form, I've used the standard scalar.fit transform library, and this what it does, it transforms the data and make it more compatible and scale down for easy computations in the clustering algorithm. Next is elbow method. So elbow method has been discussed later also. So this method helps you to find the optimal value of k. The most difficult part of k-means clustering is to find the optimal value of k beforehand, and that has to be done manually. For small data set, you can always, which are clearly visible through your eyes, you can select the value of k by just guess, or by just looking at the data. But for large data set, it is really difficult. So what we do is, using the method, we run the iterations for a number of time, and we plot the graph for the sum of the distances, that is sum of squared Euclidean distance for the different values of k. So wherever we see an elbow forming, like you can see at 2, there is a formation of an elbow at this point. So when the data is coming down, and then you can see it gradually, the decline is less. So this point we can consider as an optimal value of k, and then can proceed with it. This is my first experiment. So this is basically clustering of large dataset, for which I use Birch dataset. So I use two values of k is equal to 10 and k is equal to 100. And k is equal to 100 is the right value, and we can calculate it using elbow method, and it was also provided along the dataset. But the interesting part is, when I use k is equal to 10, then also I got the clusters. But I couldn't see any relevance between the clusters for k is equal to 10 and k is equal to 100, because there, in k is equal to 10, there's a lot of points and there are big clusters. So maybe a lot of points based on the distance are considered as a part of cluster, and they don't have any um, commonality, or basically you can say they are not related much to each other. For the experiment 2 is basically done to find the accuracy of the k-mean clustering, and this is done on the wine data that I obtained from UCI repository. So this is done this wine data had 11 features. So I selected the feature that is the quality to calculate the accuracy, and you can see on the first graph there's a count for how many for each quality, how many items we have in the data set. And then I applied the conditions to the quality section. So I divided my quality into three parameters, that is 0, 1, 2. 2 is for good, 1 is for normal, and 0 is for bad. And this is based on conditions that quality is less than 4 and quality is less than 8, and if it's between 4 and 8, it's like normal quality. And then when we run the accuracy on this data set, that we and match and try to find the, what do you say, through matching of the labels and how many elements are in the particular label. So the accuracy came out to be around 71.69%. So k-means usually have accuracy around in the 70s. Sometimes it is around 69, sometimes 60, 75. So this was the average, because every time the placement of clusters is centroid is different, and that's how the accuracy varies, because it follows a heuristic approach. So we can't guarantee exact value every time we run the algorithm. Next is experiment 3, and this was for to determine the limitations of k-mean, because from what we know is k-mean operate on the square of sum of square of Euclidean distance. So distances are obviously measured from the center points, which are the centroid. So usually we have a sphere. So whatever distances we are measuring, whatever cluster we are making, they are usually in the form of some sort of spherical or oval form or circular form. So when we have a data like moon shaped data, which we know that has a figure pattern, and we can clearly see through our eyes that cluster should be the one in the arc in the upper side and one arc in the lower side. But when we run k-mean clustering on the same algorithm, we can see we get two data points. One is this and one is this. And this data point form basically creates a cluster around it in a circular manner, and this centroid create a cluster around it in a circular manner, and this is not the result we want. So this is where k-means fail, because it doesn't calculate the probability, it does not identify the noise, it does not identify basically varying figures when we have varying data set in different figures and stuff. So that's where k-mean has a limitation. So limitations of k-means: finding the optimal value of k manually, that is we have to do, and we have to use elbow method, or we have to just do random guesses to find the value. Plus, it heavily rely on initial values of centroid. If you get good values of centroid initially, then we can less number of iterations give good result. But if you get really close centroid position initially, then there has to be a lot of iterations to get the system or algorithm to converge. Clustering from datasets of varying density and sizes is difficult. It does not scale with the number of dimensions, because we know as we increase the dimension, the real world problem can, or real world data can have a lot of dimensions to it, and that is where k-means somehow is not efficient in terms of clustering. And plus, centroids can be dragged by outliers, that is data points that are really far. So this is one thing which I observed: when your data is sparsely scattered in the plane, so you can see these yellow points, these are sparsely scattered. So there are some points who are really far from the centroid position. So what these point does is, when we calculate the sum of squared Euclidean distance, they increase the Euclidean distance to a large value, and then they pull the centroid towards their direction. Although the majority of this data set is on the right side for the yellow, but centroid would be somewhere in between, and that is because of the amount of value or weight added by the points on the left side. So this is also kind of limitations. And same, you can see these patterns on the R side. For non-spherical data, k-means just could not be used to get the right clusters. So what is the better approach? What is the alternative that we have to k-means? So when I search for the alternative, there has been a lot of research when some Gaussian mixture algorithm, GMM, and then there was some density based. So I find density based to be quite intriguing and useful. So I use DBSCAN to find the figures and to make clusters with the data set where k-mean failed. So to combat the failure of k-mean clustering to identify clusters of varying sizes and density, the density technique analyzed the density-based spatial clustering of application with noise. So this is where, the points where high density points are there and they're close to each other, this algorithm combined them in a single cluster. This algorithm has two main inputs, which is ESP, that is the maximum distance for 2 points to be considered as neighbor. You can set this value. So the smaller the value, the closer points will be considered as neighbors. And then is the minimum sample, that is the number of sample in the neighborhood of a point to consider it as a core point. So we can set this value as 100. So any point will be considered as a core point if it has 100 points around it within this ESP distance. So this is how DBSCAN work. I have a great, really good video of the animation of DBSCAN, how it works. So I'll just play that just a second. So you can see here how DBSCAN is working. So DBSCAN just take the density of the points and just try to find the neighbors of the points using the algorithm, and just put them in the same cluster. And the points which are not in the neighbor, it identifies them as noise. So this is how DBSCAN works. So when I run in my experiment 3 results, I also did use the DBSCAN to find the clustering. So you can see without noise, it clearly, effectively, in the first figure, you can see it clearly identifies all the points in the moon-shaped data set. So later on, I introduced some noise in the same data set. So you can see these green points, cluster 1 is the noise, and 2 make this noise clearly visible, I had to reduce my ESP value from 0.3 to 0.2. What it does is, so this green point at the bottom, you can see my cursor. So this was not considered a noise when I was putting 0.3 because it was considering it as a neighbor. But when I reduced the value to 0.2, so the distance between this green point at the bottom and this blue point is greater than 0.2, and that's when it considered it as a noise. So it clearly very effectively identified the shape and the noise in the system. So what are my conclusions about k-means? It is relatively easy to implement. It scales to large data sets somewhat. I mean, if data set is huge, it is good. But if you say it's going to with high dimensions, no, I would say no. It does guarantee convergence because it's considering all the points. So it generalizes the clusters of different sizes to spherical or round shaped. For experiment one, the major conclusion was K was difficult. K can be difficult to find because value K does not provide prominent insight from the data, and different data points can be clustered under one cluster. If you use a low value of K, so a lot of data points can be clustered as under one cluster where they should not be. For experiment 2, I think the accuracy was around 72%, and for DBSCAN, it was much higher. So somehow I think accuracy is also less for k-means. That can be a limitation for some applications, or some where k-means is required or clustering is required. And for experiment 3, k-means was a total failure, and DBSCAN just outperformed with identifying the shape and the noise, and it was really great. Density based clustering was really good in varying sizes or different sizes figure. So this brings me to the end of my presentation, and I would like to take you to the code which I have on my Jupyter notebook. It's on Google Colab. So what I did here is, this is to import all dependencies. This is for the collaboratory to just authorize the Google. This is for loading my data set, from the Google Drive, where I uploaded all the files. Same for this. This is white wine dataset, and this is my Birch 3 dataset. And this is for generating this plot, and this is where I added the test conditions, and after test conditions I generated new labels and new plot for the count, and the new labels, that is 0, 1, good, bad, and normal. And next is, this is for blob dataset. This is where I generated. You can look at it and you can clearly identify there are two clusters. So you can put the value of k and do clustering. It is easy. So elbow method may not be required in this, but for large dataset it is highly required. And this is for k-mean clustering script. So you can see this k-mean works on moon-like dataset. So these are the position of centroids, and this is what we obtain. And when I find the accuracy for the wine set, it came out this time to be somewhere around 73. And next is for the elbow method. This script is for the elbow method, and I've shown you the output in the presentation. So this generated a graph, which is basically your outputs. And this method is for generating moon data and moon shape data. This added to the noise. So this is what we get the data after adding noise to it. And when we run our k-means on it, I mean DBSCAN on it, so we can see, okay, these are the noise and these are the clusters. We get blue one, orange one, and the green are the noise. So yeah, this is the entire analysis of clustering which I did for my final project, and I hope you guys get an insight about the clustering, and it was useful. Thank you.